remember we were thinking last week about that statement that starts it's the beginning of Luke, that Jesus continued to grow in wisdom, character, and favour with God and man. And we thought about how that became wisdom became in Jesus' teaching his disciples. You are truly my disciples, you'll know the truth. See, truth is about wisdom. It's understanding, wisdom, knowledge. There's something that starts by hitting the head, and the truth will make you free. So we expect something of those ideas that hit the head to start to have an impact in us, because freedom is more of a feeling. It starts to turn into a feeling. It becomes something in character. And actually, at the core of that character development very often is the practice of love. And actually then socially, that very often becomes favour, i.e. favour with our connections. There's grace on our connections. We do better in the way we interact with others. We do better in the way we interact with the Lord, because those things have developed fruit in us. And so I'm really just kind of summarising that little bit that we did. We thought about actually how in modern psychology you've got this very popular metaphor of training the elephant or whispering to the elephant, which really is kind of just a modern way of talking about what Paul talks about, the good that I would do but I don't do. And because my old nature, my sinful nature that was shaped by sin, but actually is my instinctive way, there's an emotional layer to who we are, which actually has been shaped by our environment. And so it has certain ways of doing things. And we're not going to change that instantly, because that's part of our humanity. But the way in which it does tend to get changed is the same way it developed, which is we make a little decision, we have an experience, we process it and we think about it. But now as we do it with the Holy Spirit, there's a layer by layer, there's a transformation going on in us. So wisdom and truth, when we reflect on it, produces new habits, which can rewire our old instincts so it becomes better behaviour, and that improves our social outcomes. So we get a better kind of connection. You see that wisdom, character, favour thread going on again. So then the Sermon on the Mount obviously is going to raise a standard. We've got ideas in here, but actually I 100% believe that when Jesus gave them, there was a sense in which the ideas were to drive practice and habits. And if we drive those practices and habits by the guidance of the Holy Spirit, who according to John, as we saw in Romans, the Spirit effectively intervenes. He understands our weaknesses and effectively intervenes. He cooperates with that process. So there is a remarkable transformational process that we have within the Christian faith, some of which is embedded in our humanity. So actually culture around us can improve itself. But actually we also have the guidance of the help of the Holy Spirit, who works with that process. And that's my kind of understanding of the developmental nature of the New Testament. As you see it reflected in Jesus, what he teaches his disciples, and then it's picked up by Paul. And part of that dialogue, if you want to think of it like this, is I find it's very easy to look at it and say, but why didn't Jesus tell us more? But actually, if he tried to tell us more, we would just come back to the head only. It's partly because he invites us into a process which he starts off with his disciples, who then pass on to others. So Paul himself, when he's doing it with Timothy, it's still part of the on-flowing kind of outflow. And that process is something that's often is shepherded and steered and guided by the Holy Spirit. So I'm just kind of trying to describe the process of transformation, which I think then gives truth to that verse in the Old Testament where it says righteousness lifts up a nation. So in the Sermon on the Mount, we're often seeing it in quite brief snapshots. I mean, it was the faith that the disciples had that the Holy Spirit would somehow take these little snapshots that they were recording for us, giving to us, and that they would be worked out as part of a process that really changes things. It's not just the facts, it's what we do with them. I'm going to, so if you'd like to join in this spinner wheel, I'm going to pick somebody who's here. It makes it more exciting. You don't know if it will be you. You get to kind of answer on these things. So we got 5 players who want to play. Should we go for any more? Anybody else like to join in? I'm just going to spin the wheel. And I'm going to ask you if you'd like to share a quick anecdote. Also from Barry and Janet. Okay, so going back to where we were, If I go up a slide. I said at the end of last week this issue about starting to tell bits of your story. So Barry or Janet, I just wondered if I could encourage you to do this. And it seems trivial, and these aren't yet into the, we're not yet into the Sermon on the Mount, but we're taking ideas that you find actually are threaded through the New Testament and which we now know are psychologically very good for you. I just wondered whether Barry or Janet would just like to share a little fact about themselves for everybody. Don't feel embarrassed and think, oh dear, I'm being proud about myself.
Janet's going to say something.
Yeah. My remark was I was grateful for fine weather on food bank days, and that's because the work that we do with food bank, where I volunteer with the food, most of the work is done outside. When the food is delivered, it's left outside, we wait and sort it, and it's all outside. So I'm always grateful on Mondays and Thursdays when it doesn't rain, and I always pray that it won't rain between 10 and 12. And since lockdown, we haven't had any rain on a Monday or a Thursday morning between 10 and 12. It may rain before and it may rain after, but during that time, we don't have any rain. And I do share this with the volunteers because they'll say, oh, we've been lucky today with the weather. The volunteers that we have down at Food Bank are not Christians. And they say, oh, we're lucky we've had no rain. And I just say, no, I prayed today that it wouldn't rain. So that's just a quick
fantastic. Janet, you could not have given me a better example of actually how the practice of our Christian faith takes an idea and embeds it into habit. You know, in other words, of that thing, you've got a practice of prayer, and actually you notice when your prayers are having an effect, that actually the Lord has taken into account, because despite all the other agendas, the crops and so on, there's something that he's done there that actually, as you reflect on it, you know that sense of actually I'm blessed, which is where we were last week. And that sense of being blessed gives us more confidence. It also helps to see things, not just in terms of what we're doing, but there's a story involved. The story means that actually it's important that I do it. That's often the way, isn't it? If you think about what makes a good story, it's not that something happens, it's that somebody that you care about did it. Although what we're talking sometimes about can seem very abstract, and particularly when we look at some of the data and the science, in practice it comes down to quite simple things. It's not rocket science, it's actually just regular Christian life. But actually understanding how these things are affecting us is just sometimes useful to point out to a few other folks as well. So thanks, that was really unkind of me to spin the wheel, because you never know who you're going to get. You might get someone who's terribly embarrassed, but maybe in faith we trust that we end up with the right person, because that couldn't have been more perfect, really, as a wonderful little example of those things. So in many ways we're unpacking the concept of blessed are you, well, blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, and then Jesus turns it around, blessed are you when you're persecuted for the sake of righteousness. And this is one of two occasions in the Beatitudes list where Jesus has highlighted righteousness. This is the first one we're going to unpack, is to do with persecution and righteousness. So I just thought it was worth taking a little step back and understanding from the kind of the best modern understanding we have of righteousness. It's a work in progress. So I've thrown a couple of folks up there, and to stop and think about this rather than me just throw the words out. But Richard Schrader was a cultural anthropologist. Up until about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago now, a lot of thinking about morality was done at the rational level of the brain. So in other words, we can work it out. We do it mentally, and this is what makes something moral and so on. But Richard Schrader kind of noticed something, which is that he was an anthropologist looking all over the world, that cultures often had instincts in which he put into three areas. So he talked about autonomy, which is often summarized as how free am I to be what I'd like to be, how much am I constrained, and that they often kind of start to develop ideas of morality that often reflect that level of freedom an individual has. They also then balance with that, and intersecting with it, they think about community. You know, that it's fine for me to do what I want to do and I'm free to do it, but sometimes it has an impact on the community. So actually suddenly there are community considerations that now play over that, and they kind of interlace with it. And they very often will have a strong sense of things that are shaped by a sense of the sacred or the divine. And that actually you kind of get an interplay of these three areas. And then we start to kind of out of that develop certain threads of what we think of as moral thinking. So he was a big influence then on the Jonathan Haidt, who's the guy, as you're looking at your screens, is on your right. I saw he was ranked in the New York Times as one of the world's now 15 most influential people, and he's a psychologist. And it's because his understanding of moral instinct, which he developed from Richard Schwader's ideas. So he often will talk about 6 dimensions of morality that kind of interplay. And what he found, and why he's so significant, is because when people have looked at these, they found a very strong correlation with things you can predict. In other words, the big one that made people sit up and notice was if people get a similar score when he measures how much care versus harm plays in their decision making, or fairness versus cheating plays in their decision making, i.e. making moral decisions. Liberty versus oppression, I put in yellow because it was added later. He originally started with 5, but he's added that one since. Loyalty versus betrayal to people, authority versus subversion, sanctity versus degradation. He would ask people questions, he would give them a score, you would develop a profile, and what they found is that the profile tended to predict a huge number of attitudes and things that the people would do. So it was very successful. So it got a lot of instinct behind it. So I just thought, as a kind of a simple little activity, it'd be nice just to kind of first of all say which of those 3 moral spheres of Richard Schwader's spheres seems most important to you. If you're thinking about things from a moral point of view, what's righteous and what's not righteous, which one of those would be most important to you? And it's interesting because I was thinking about it for myself, and I kept thinking in different places. Actually, on this occasion, I think autonomy is really important. I don't like the idea. I'm someone who's been vaccinated and would totally want to do that to be responsible to my community. But equally, I don't like the idea of someone being forced to have something put into their body. Do you see? So my community instinct and my autonomy sometimes play against each other. How do I make a decision? Which one wins? Issues of sanctity and divinity. There might be behaviours that someone could do that in one sense don't hurt anyone except themselves. It's their choice. But actually something about it makes me think, no, they shouldn't. So I just thought I'd give folks the opportunity on their phones to say, just choose which one actually means the most to you. Is it community? Is it that personal sense of individual freedom and expression? Is it to do with the ideas of sanctity, divinity? So we got a 1-on-1 at the moment. It's not that there's necessarily a right answer, but I just wanted to kind of, as we think about it, you start to see how these things interplay when we think in terms of morality. So two coming in on community. It's interesting. It's interesting at the moment no one's come in with on autonomy here so far. Oh, we have got one. Yeah, we have. There you go. That second one is from me. I've just added that one. And as I said, it's interesting though how they're kind of even balancing out to a degree. So we've got 7 respondees. There are only 7 of us on the app at the moment. But can you see, as you start to think about it, you can see how these things kind of fit together. If we come back, we've got those other dimensions. They're Jonathan Haidt's ones. I just wondered if just take a minute. We won't take too long on it. It'd just be interesting to see. If you go back to your phone, you can actually now give a score. How important? Score each of Jonathan Haidt's 6 dimensions of moral instinct. So how important do you think those different things are to you? And I'll show you why in a minute, because this actually is how he starts to profile people. And part of the reason why he's been referred to as one of the 15 most influential thinkers in the world is because it turns out that as people score these things and express their preference, sometimes by direct measurement, etc., you can actually see quite a lot of similar patterns emerging in them. So you think about it and think, okay, how important is it whether someone gets hurt or not to me? Now that seems like a hard question, and obviously we can all say, well, that's really important. What about fairness and cheating? You know, if something is fair or not, and fairness, how much does that go down the line? Is fairness an opportunity? That's important to me, but fairness of outcome, is that? Because I might think, well, okay, but there's got to be some randomness, because if not, everything gets blended the same. How much does liberty and oppression matter to me? Do I care if Afghanistan is left to its own devices, whether people are free or not anymore? How much does that motivate me? So if you've got your phones and you can just kind of try and score each one, you've got a simple kind of, you can say little or much, little or poor or excellent is the thing. So now I didn't put anybody's names in there, so we're not trying to judge each other. But the thing that's kind of interesting is one of the things that has been a very practical outcome of Jonathan's way of looking at it, Jonathan Haidt's way of looking at righteousness, morality, according to these different kind of dimensions that he works through. I'm just going to make it slightly bigger. Is you can actually see a kind of how things divide up politically. So on the whole, and he's talking about the US situation, well, when I say on the whole, what he found was a very clear correlation, which is that people who are more conservative, do it with a small c, tend to have a reasonably even balanced kind of sense of appreciation of each of the 6 dimensions that he measures of righteousness. So they care that people are either receiving care or they're not getting hurt. They care about fairness and not that people who are cheating don't get ahead, but they will care about fairness of opportunity, but they don't care so much maybe about fairness of outcome, because they might think that actually there are other things as well to be involved. They care about liberty and oppression, but it's all moderated. So his understanding, and as he presented it, which of course caused a bit of a storm. So it's not that this has not been tested; it's been tested hugely because people didn't like it very much. Because one of the things he said is, although he said himself he was a liberal, he said he thinks that's probably why, on the whole, in the US, conservatives win more elections. He said because they address more issues that matter, whereas the liberals on the other side very often didn't notice 3 of these areas at all. And he kind of presents them and says maybe this is a bit of an instinct. And libertarians sit in the kind of middle area. They only really care about 2 things. They only care about how free or not they are, how much autonomy, and whether something is fair or whether it's biased towards somebody. And that's a very secondary kind of consideration. And I'm not wanting to make any kind of political statements, but it's just interesting to notice that, because after I read his stuff, I started to notice it in political debates. One of the things he would draw out, for instance, is he would say that it's not actually that liberals don't touch on these 3 greyed out areas, but that it's more that it's more that they get absorbed into something else. So, for instance, the issue of sanctity and degradation. He said people on the left often will be vegans or vegetarians. They have a very strong sense of what you should and shouldn't put in your mouth. They may not have any strong sense of who you do or don't have sexual relationships with, but they will care a lot about what you eat. But they've often turned it into a care or harm. So it's because we care for nature, we care for wildlife. So it's still there, but it's just that those things have been absorbed into the other things. He's been very successful in helping to bridge the divide by helping kind of people see how they prioritize different areas of righteousness in different ways. So I'm just kind of giving you, this is kind of the current state of thinking, worldly thinking, when it comes to how do you understand righteousness. Now, Jesus has things to say. Scripture has a lot to say on righteousness. From a Christian kind of point of view, so we're going to unpack that. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So this is the first one. From a Christian point of view, I sum up the concept of righteousness as being, it's not just doing the right thing, but it's also doing the right thing in the right way. And that's a really important kind of distinction. And the right way is actually we do it in cooperation with the Lord. There's a verse where God says, when he's looking back about, he said it's not he's I'm just trying to remember what it was. I hadn't thought to present it tonight, but it helps illustrate this. He on several points in the Old Testament, God looks back at when he gave them the law and said he only gave them the law because at the time the thing that was really important was that they weren't listening to his voice. So because they wouldn't listen to his voice, which was a dynamic thing, he gave them the law, which is a written thing, static thing, but at least you can do what it says there. Of course they didn't. But the key thing, he said, this was a substitute for the fact you weren't hearing my voice. You weren't listening to my voice. And so from a kind of Christian point of view, it's not just that you do the right thing. So the law says don't commit adultery, but actually we're doing it out of the context of our relationship with the Lord. Out of love for God, I have brought my sexual drives under constraint. I've shaped them and directed them in the way he's led me, if that makes sense. So it's not just that he said it, but actually somehow I'm trying to hear him. I'm trying to dialogue with him. And so that's doing it the right way. It's doing the right thing in the right way. The way Paul puts it, of course, is the kingdom of God is not just eating and drinking, but righteousness, peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. And I remember spotting that little phrase, righteousness, peace and joy in the Holy Spirit, which is what the kingdom of God's all about, his rulership over us and his lives. And there was an interesting kind of tie-in with a real old classic piece of psychology, which you may have come across, which we refer to as Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, he talks about how everyone has these needs, and you have to put the base ones in, and you kind of start going up, and so there's basic physiological needs. You need warmth, you need clothing, and then that warmth and clothing becomes layers of protection. You have a home, you have family around you. Out of that family, you then want that to be a loving family. So there's a kind of a narrowing as we go up, and not only is it loving, but out of those relationships, you now start to draw esteem. You have a need for esteem, and the top level, which he talked about as being self-actualization, is not only you now esteem, but you have that sense of really you're living life the way you were supposed to the way it makes sense. And I put at the top righteousness, well-being and joy, because you will often find now in more modern thinking, they've taken the sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and there's a kind of a sense where you can see the base layers are very physical, they're very about pleasure. And then they become more psychological, it becomes happiness. And then it becomes more abstract, these ideas of righteousness, well-being and joy. There's actually a psychological definition of joy, trust times purpose, believe it or not, and which actually sounds very much like righteousness, peace and joy. That actually, if you like, there's some basics, foundations, but as we go up, as we get to the top where we find righteousness, it's not just good enough that I've got enough food to eat and I'm warm. It's not just good enough that I feel safe, and it's not just good enough I have family and I relate to them. It's not just good enough that I feel good about my work and I achieve a lot, but something about it, doing it in the way that actually makes sense of who I've been made to be. Now suddenly it's coming under the jurisdiction of the Lord. So I just kind of putting these ideas out really just to help see how they're coming together and how the two fit. But as we kind of come then onto this now in the Sermon on the Mount, the first introduction of the idea of righteousness, we get this paradox of experience. So you're blessed, okay? So that's really good for you. You're blessed. We thought about this last time. This isn't blessed are those. This is a now you are. So blessed are those when people insult you, and blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you. So we've got that reframing. Okay, I'm going through something negative. First of all, Lord is saying reframe it. I'm telling you, as the person you follow, as someone you've given authority to, as someone you've been willing to follow up the mountain, we've gone up the mountain with you. I'm saying to you, you're blessed when people insult you, and when they persecute you, and even when they falsely say all kinds of evil against you. And in different ways, we've all gone through different levels. I could put my hand up to having had all three of those things happen to me over the years, often places you don't expect it to. And other people have gone through it much worse than I have, but most of us have had some level of experience of all of those things. And weirdly, if we want to do what Jesus teaches us, if we want to abide in his word, as he puts it in John, and his word abides in us, and actually that's the way that we start to get into his discipleship program. You're truly my disciples. If you abide in my word, then you are really my disciples, and you will know the truth, and truth will set you free. You see, that's how it starts. If I'm really going to take his word seriously, I've got to say, okay, so I'm actually blessed. There's something about the fact I'm being persecuted and insulted, which is God's favour on me. That's an odd thing. Versus, as I say, the wonderful thing, here's the paradox of experience. So let your light shine before men, they may see your good deeds and give glory to your Father. And that there is a kind of a paradox. One's a kind of red, stop, and the other's a green, go. There's something nice about doing good things. People like it, but they also will sometimes persecute you. So I can reframe it. There's something blessed in this. And as I was thinking about this, actually, I'll come to. There's an interesting to try and understand why we get this paradox. There's a 2013 research paper. It's called "Moral Character Predominates in Person Perception and Evaluation." Written by these three guys, and what it concluded was that moral character, i.e., righteousness, as they would understand it, being consistent to your values, is how they understood this idea of moral character. If you live consistently to your values, and they tend to be, however you understand those, that is the most important factor in perception formation and identity construction. Their words rather than mine. What they basically mean is that people value moral consistency more than any other character trait. There are huge benefits to being seen as being moral. What they found is it was more attractive in a leader than warmth. That used to be thought to be the most important factor. You could be an evil leader, but as long as they're warm, people would follow you. Well, it turns out that even though their morality might be bad, it's people who are consistent in their moral character are actually most attractive to us. And strangely, that made sense of a guy who was one of my own disciples, a guy called Winky Pratney, who used to work with young people off the street. He would actually say that it's more important for a young person coming in off the street that you are consistent than that you are kind. That used to sound counterintuitive to me. And actually, he'd say that's why in the Old Testament, what you see God establishing is that God is fair. He is consistent. And when you get into the New Testament, it's much more explicit that God is love. Now, God is love is in there, but what's primarily put out is he's just, he's fair, he's kind, he's consistent. And so I just thought it was really interesting that they're now saying this kind of moral character is really foundational to what we find attractive and what draws us. And so there are huge benefits, of course, if I'm seen as moral. And that's where the problem comes in. It's so powerful, and we know it. We know that we are drawn to people who are morally consistent. And so we want to be seen as morally consistent. And so it produces the habit that Jesus addresses so often, which is, of course, religious hypocrisy or moral hypocrisy. Moral hypocrisy, I've got my little Dilbert cartoon. So before I make a decision, I like to ask your opinions. It's supposed to make you feel engaged. And then Dilbert asks, and do you actually listen to us? He says, I'm hoping it will look that way on the outside. And we do an awful lot in life to appear like we're good people, appear like we care. So much so that in a 2015 paper that reviewed over 500 social psychology pieces of research into moral behaviour, so Professor Jesse Graham actually concluded that moral hypocrisy was the construct with 1,000 faces that the entire field of social psychology, he said, could be called the science of moral hypocrisy. Because actually people so desire to be seen as moral that they fake it everywhere. So it's actually very, very common that people speak a level of behavior that they don't live up to. Is that making sense? Now, I sent that little video for folks to watch before we came to this evening. I don't know if anyone's watched it or not. But what's his name? Sapolsky is talking about. Can't remember his first name now. It's ridiculous. I can remember his second name, which is so much more complicated. He talked about when you put people in an fMRI scanner and you give them the opportunity to lie, you see with an awful lot of people they're wrestling with should I, shouldn't I? But some people it's just there, they just don't. And actually that was one of the findings he made. There are a number of things he discovered in his meta-analysis of all this research. So some of them are kind of obvious, but hypocrites gain motivation from a desire to look good more than an internal desire to satisfy personal goals. That's sort of stating what we'd expect. So in other words, the fact that we know that we value moral integrity in others is that we end up desiring it more than we want to live it. So one of the things he found, which is always disturbing, is that creative thinkers are more likely to be hypocrites because in actual fact they also are more likely to self-deceive, because very often we don't like to confront the truth of when we're not that moral on the inside. But we all, to some level or other, will create narratives to justify decisions that we often made for bad reasons. So sometimes I feel jealous of something that someone's got, and so I find myself being a little bit sarcastic about an idea they have. Okay, these things happen. But I tell myself that I needed to do this because, and I've come up with a creative idea. Unfortunately, that creative thinking allows creative thinkers to self-deceive a bit more. So it can be quite common. So one of the things that sometimes you have to suggest is if you want creative thinkers on a team, you have to have a certain level of tolerance for the fact that some of the ways they explain things won't be quite as true as they might be. Narcissists have a greater sense of entitlement and so excuse themselves for their failings. In other words, if you've got tendencies towards narcissism, you will use your creative thinking to the extreme. That's perhaps a way of putting that. But there are people who genuinely value morality and make it a part of their identity. In other words, this process we're talking about, somehow the concept of righteousness has become so much a part of me that it's not a mental struggle when I'm presented with lying, because lying is just something I don't do. Is that making sense? And that is a process that you can go through. And actually part of the research that you're looking at, it's not exclusively, but of course there will be an awful lot of people whose religious conviction has been internalized in a way that actually means that's what settled it for them. One of the sad things they found was that being religious or not, which will include Christians but others as well, doesn't necessarily make you more likely or less likely to be a hypocrite, except that in the broad sense. But actually it was also something that was those who were often had. So I've not quite got that right, have I? So in other words, there was no guarantee just because you were religious that you would have that kind of I just don't lie, so it's no struggle. Stick their head in an fMRI scanner and you'll see they're struggling with it. And if they're struggling with it, the wrong conditions, they will cheat. They will do those things. But some people who have made it so much a part of their identity, and actually therefore religious conviction is one of the ways that happens, actually it's just a settled issue. And so I look at these things, and from a discipleship point of view, I understand people are on this journey. The Spirit is working with them. And as a part of that, you can have certain amounts of grace in the process, because actually for some people, they're trying to do it by grit. They're trying to do it by making the right decision, and it's a struggle. For others of us who walked a bit longer, that's a very arrogant way of me to say it, isn't it? I'm just saying there's certain things that I probably find a lot easier because they're just settled. And that's part of the way in which the Holy Spirit develops us. Just a side issue here, most people are affected by witnessing good acts and will feel a stronger desire to act in a moral way. So we're going to touch on that because Jesus touches something of this. So actually moral behaviour is infectious when it's genuine. Not when it's fake, but when it's genuine in a culture. it actually rubs off, because we kind of start to be able to trust it a bit more. I remember this. I went and looked for it. I was really pleased to find this little still. I got the still from a video on YouTube. It's from the film The Robe. So that's Judas on the side, behind my head. Move out of the way. There you go. And Judas is just explaining to Demetrius that Jesus of Nazareth has been crucified, and he said, why? And Judas replies, because they can dream of truth, but they can't live with it. And that's part of the tension. See, so we value truth hugely. We want people to be true with us, but not everybody has internalized it to the point where the temptations for other things mean that it's genuine. So there's an awful lot of hypocrisy, but because there's a lot of hypocrisy, it is our instinct to assume hypocrisy, and that's an easier thing to assume. So we don't really assume, and you think about how when people are running someone down who they don't like, they'll say, well, they did that, but, blah, blah, blah. In other words, what they're saying is there's a level of hypocrisy that in a culture where it's normalized, we expect other people to have. And as a result, that's one of the reasons why sometimes we dislike people who present too morally. It's easier to cope with someone who's not trying to present better than I do and I can't see through them. And so it does actually annoy folks. We're going to look a little bit more when we come back to the issue of righteousness, when we look at those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. We're going to look at the impact of this cultural aspect. The guy I put up, Robert Cialdini, was probably one of the first pop psychologists ever. In the last 15 years, he's been researching cultural issues. And actually, one of the things he discovered is there's a huge cost in a culture to dishonesty. So actually, moral failure puts an incredible stress that has a bottom line impact on businesses. In his book, well, he won't name it. He won't name the company. He talks about a company that lost billions on the stock exchange because of a culture that actually tolerated dishonesty within it, as a kind of a cautionary tale, without telling us which the company was, which I think is a shame. I'd love to know. So there is a real.
There's probably several companies. There's probably several companies that fall in that category.
There probably are. The one the point he makes is, it's not because the thing was discovered externally. It wasn't discovered externally that they were immoral. It was the impact it had internally that caused the breakdown of the company that then cost billions. So he was highlighting, it's not just because you got found out. It's actually the impact that their research actually showed it had on the workforce and the turnover of staff and all of those sorts of things, which is fascinating. But anyway, so just some conclusions before we get into the text. Jesus is going to address righteousness. It's going to show we're going to hit some angst because of it, but people will also honor God for it. So we want to do it. We're blessed because we're doing it. That's a good thing. If I can get hold of that, reframe it as I'm blessed if I'm getting persecuted for righteousness because I'm doing it well, if I can put it that way. Righteousness is highly desired, so it makes us highly desired, but it's also something that's mistrusted, which can be one of the reasons why it actually attracts a kind of attack. So it's coming into the text. So you're blessed when people insult and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. So be cheerful and celebrate for your great heavenly reward. So be cheerful and celebrate for your great heavenly reward. After all, this is how they persecuted the prophets before you. And I love the cleverness of the way Jesus presents this. Interestingly, and this is often a shock to people when you say it. I remember, I can't tell you now exactly in every book, but I went and did it when I heard it first time. That the concept of heavenly rewards in heaven, rewards that for the age to come, are in every single book in the New Testament. Every single book in the New Testament refers to rewards in heaven. Heaven isn't the reward; there are rewards in heaven. Can you hear that? Now we miss that because we've been so steeped in the kind of the Reformation. It is by faith and not works. And actually, it's a slightly biased way we've done it. I'm not saying that's not true. It is true. We are saved by faith, not by works. But there is actually, we've so downgraded the works because of a reaction against the works-based gospel that we've missed that actually all of the New Testament refers to rewards in heaven. based on actually how we live our Christian life. And so that's just something to notice there. And interestingly, I put it here, this reframing and rewards, because actually there is some psychological logic towards the idea of actually internalizing and creating new habits. So one of the ways that you will be taught to develop new habits is by framing to find things that you can treat as rewards and reframing things around that. So we've got both of these ideas here in Jesus. So to give you an example, if you're trying to diet and you say, as long as I diet through the week, at the weekend I can pig out, okay? So I'm giving myself a reward, okay? Now that we're going to see that doesn't quite work. Actually, it can sometimes produce the opposite. However, if I say during the day, this small way, do you know what, I'm not going to eat between meals, and because I'm not eating between meals, when I have the lunch, I will give myself a chamomile tea. You know, I drink fruit teas. Chamomile tea is hardly satisfying the fact that I'm hungry because I haven't eaten. But what I do is, because in my head I frame it as my reward, okay? So it's not even that great. It's not going to fill me up, a chamomile tea, if I can put it that way. But I frame it as my reward. Because I didn't eat during meals, I'm going to frame it, I'm going to have a cup of tea. It actually helps me stick to the habit. So something that's not much of a pleasure, so I'm not really getting the pleasure of the reward, I'm getting the prefrontal cortex tick box that says I made it and I gave myself the reward. Does that make sense? That actually helps me keep doing it. I think I put them here, yeah. Recognizing something as a reward is a form of reframing, basically. So as we've talked about before, the recognized reward creates a positive emotion, which is separate from the pleasure. So it could be that I say that at lunchtime I'll give myself an after 8 mint. You know, that's a bit of a sugar rush. There's a pleasure with that. It's better than the chamomile tea, but it doesn't have to be. Because just the fact that I've marked this is the thing, this little thing is my reward, and because I've achieved this, I've got my reward, it actually gives me a positive reinforcement that actually helps the habit to develop. And so actually, if you put those in the words of Jesus, he's actually done that. The rewards in heaven are quite complex to put your finger on. We know from the New Testament loads of things. There is something of a reward that's there, and I hold on to that truth. Here's the other thing. Rewards build habits only if they are not totally predictable. Okay. So the problem here might be if actually it's really easy and trivial for me to go between meals without snacking, then actually I get the reward every single day. So actually my brain says it's not really a reward, you're faking it. But when I can't predict whether I'm going to get it or not, and then I kind of mark it, I get my reward. That has a really good impact to help me keep going at what I do. So think about what's happened. I don't know what day I'm going to get insulted for doing the right thing. I can't tell that just because I told the truth today, that's going to get me insulted, but sometimes it will. And when it does, if I remind myself that actually, as Jesus said, from his authority, my reward in heaven has gone up, I actually, at a mental level, even though I get no pleasure, if I can put it that way, from that idea, the idea itself actually has an impact in me. Now, what I'm sharing, what I'm talking to, you might say, oh, I'm being convoluted. Well, maybe, but this is what they found. The idea of a reward, quite separate from the pleasure of the thing you've made into the reward, is what sometimes helps us to keep it going, as long as it's not totally predictable. It's not something I just get every day. In which case, emotionally I don't treat it as a reward. Oh, and the other thing is it's not going to be in diametric conflict with the pain of the accomplishment. So in other words, it seems that if you reward yourself for dieting with something that's a big blowout meal, somehow you don't get the habit forming effect. So it might still feel good. It might feel like, yeah, I made it. It might help you have grit to go for it, but it doesn't help you form the habit. But actually, just marking the fact that I've been rewarded is part of how you turn something into much more of that instinctive internal habit. How we move from struggling to do the right thing, but actually as I do the right thing, and every now and again I get into trouble with someone who doesn't like it. You know, I think about I've been in several work situations where people want you to lie on their behalf. one of the things is I found as time has gone by, it's easier if they know and you have a reputation for honesty. Because when you say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to say that, they can accept it from you much more easily than right at the beginning. And when it's, why can't you? Don't you like me? Do you hate me? Do you see? And it becomes like that. It's a much tougher thing. But when you do go through those things, you think, okay, Jesus says, my reward in heaven is great because I'm getting persecuted for doing the right thing. He affirmed to me that by doing this, I'm being rewarded. I'm going to mark that. I'm going to at some sort of subconscious level, it actually helps me to internalize the fact that my identity is I don't. Does that make sense? I'm not just doing it for the pleasure. I'm doing it for the reward. The concept of the reward is now settling in me. So that's quite a kind of some quite sophisticated psychological research around some of that area, and I just think it's interesting to see it embedded in the words of Jesus. And then he goes on, so you're the salt of the earth, but if the salt becomes tasteless, what is it going to be salted? It's good for nothing anymore except for throwing out to be trampled on by people or by men. I put the connection to there's harvest. That's the parable of the sower. It's not a very strong reference, but about seed that gets trodden on, the idea of being trodden on. But also in the phrase about the destruction of Jerusalem, and so it's been understood right away from the early days of the church by commentators that there's something of a warning to the Jewish people here in Jesus in what he's saying. If you've lost the salt of the earth, there's this you're worth nothing except being thrown out and trampled on, because he then talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, about them overrunning and trampling on them. You see. And so there is something here of a warning to his listeners, the Jewish listeners. If the salt's become tasteless, what's it going to be salted? It's good for nothing except being thrown out and trampled on. I don't particularly see this as a prophecy at this stage. That comes later, but it perhaps it's part of the framework. And that idea of salt is there are ideas which we have lost. Scholars have tried to reconstruct them in the ancient world. We know that salt seems to be tied with the process of making a covenant, and we see it in the Old Testament, for instance. We don't fully understand exactly how it worked because we seem to have lost that context, but we can see it referenced not just in the Bible but in other cultures as well. Every offering of your grain offering shall be seasoned with salt. You will not allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be lacking from your grain offering. So salt in one sense is part of any of our offering to the Lord. The ideas of righteousness in terms of offering to God should have salt in it. All the sacred gifts that Israelites set aside for God I give to you and your sons and to the daughters that are with you as a due for all time. It shall be an everlasting covenant of salt. So here there's a gift being given, and again it's referred to as with salt and covenant before God and for you and your offspring as well. And of David as well, it said, should you not know that the God of Israel gave the kingdom over of Israel to David forever, to him and his sons, by a covenant of salt. So salt seems to be integral in terms of our service, and perhaps it puts the covenant, the law, into the framework in Jesus' teaching. So we saw last week how Matthew had set up the intro to the Sermon on the Mount in terms of the with 8 Beatitudes as being the fulfillment of the 10 Commandments. Structurally, the sermon follows a similar structure to the outlaying of the commandments. 10 at the front, then unpacked in what comes after it. So we saw all of that last week, and here there's a covenant of salt. So there's something of salt which is in the process of what Jesus is giving them. And I think that it is along the lines of what I've been driving at, because we actually find when we try and trace this idea of the covenant of salt down in Jewish thinking, that it treats the 10 Commandments in a similar way to what I'm saying I think you should treat the Beatitudes as, which is it's not so much the exact did I keep it tick box or not, but actually that somehow I've engaged with it in a way where it's internalized and become a part of me, and that's how the covenant has become salt in us, and that's what the rabbis used to think. So they were familiar with these ideas. The Talmuds actually record a first century, although it's post-temple destruction, debate, which kind of make reference to the idea of salt getting spoiled or losing its saltiness. It's slightly different to the context about Jesus, and it may even be because Jesus' statement is known by this rabbi when he makes this. But there's this after the destruction of the temple, there's a debate that's recorded in the Talmud's Bekarat 8b, line 15. So you can look it up if you like. You'll notice the white triangle, the white question marks. I've marked out the references, I think, there to the three questions, the end of the three questions. So they asked him. So the Greek philosophers asked this Jewish rabbi, when salt gets spoiled, what do you use to preserve it? And his response is, we use the placenta of a mule. And they asked, do mules have a placenta? Because mules, of course, they don't reproduce, so they don't have one. And he says, does salt spoil? He retorted. Now, that might be in reference because Jesus talks about salt losing its saltiness, but equally it's more likely to be reflective of this idea that the rabbis had, which is that the Ten Commandments are salt and that we've worked them into us and they've had their impact in us, you see. And so he's saying that those commandments are never going to go out of date. They're never going to go rotten. They'll always be fresh, is really what he's driving at. So we come to Jesus' statement. It's true that salt doesn't lose its flavour, but equally, ocean salt, if you try and get salt out of the ocean, it's typically about 85% sodium chloride. So it's 15% is not so salty. But if you go and get salt out of the Dead Sea, it's actually only 30.5% sodium, and it's a whole mix of other things as well. Very relaxing to have a bath in, apparently. But not a huge, and equally in the kind of the Dead Sea basin around there, you can actually mine salt out of it as well. And so but what you're digging up is not pure salt. So it's salt, which might actually be what the phrase "salt of the earth" is all about. Salt of the earth is. It might be that it's either salt that's been dug out of the earth, or it's salt that its primary use actually is in fertilizing. These are the kind of the concepts or thoughts. So Jesus is not that he got it wrong when he said salt loses its saltiness. He's talking about the process within Judea, where salt has been drawn out of the Dead Sea, which case it's very impure, or it's been dug out of the ground, which case it's pretty impure. You try and refine it if you're going to cook with it or try and preserve with it, because it's used for all of these things. If it depending on its quality, you can use it for flavoring, you can use it to purify, you can use it to preserve, or you can use it as a ground fertilizer, which then gives a bit of context. Oh, sorry. That fertilizing, also preserving. I put through this little slide in the petrified wood principle is referred to, which was the psychologist I put up earlier, Robert Cialdini, when he was a younger man, was one of the first people who did some research onto this. You may have famously heard about the petrified forest in the US, in Arizona. And they used to have signs up like these, your heritage is being vandalized every day by theft losses of petrified wood, 14 tons a year, and mostly a small piece at a time, or help preserve the park. Thousands of pieces of petrified wood are taken home by tourists every year. And what they were finding is people kept on taking it. When they researched it, they found when you put signs like this up, more people take petrified wood home than don't. Because what you're doing is you're normalizing a certain level of behavior. So you're normalizing that people take wood home with them. And so people don't think to themselves it's wrong. They just think everybody else is doing it. I'll have a piece. And so they take it. So if you replace them with things that say, 90% of our park visitors respect each other and and actually you focus on the mass who don't do that, you actually, less people steal petrified wood. There's an interesting phenomena, because this story has been told quite a lot, where now every year they receive hundreds of thousands of in weight it is, but they receive hundreds of letters with pieces of wood that were stolen by people who felt guilty about it, as they've heard since. But the thing I'm really drawing out is that that actually, if we've lost our saltiness, we're becoming part of the crowd that makes no difference. Actually, the more righteousness there is in a culture, we're going to look at this in more detail, as I say, in a few weeks' time. In a culture, the more there is, the more it becomes infectious, and people just behave better. The more you draw attention to how many people do the wrong thing, strangely, the more you weaken that kind of coercive power of this is the standard. This is the kind of the invisible standard I have, and I quite like to see that, because it gives context to the idea of Christendom. So as a younger Christian, I used to be despising of the concept of Christendom because you want people to really know the Lord. Christendom really, though, is the cultural impact of a large number of folks who are internalizing this habit. And it's because large numbers of people have internalized righteousness, actually the general population will behave better. There will be a kind of a raising of the standard because actually the mass of people adhere to it and accept it. And so it's not trivial when actually we normalize bad behavior because we say, well, we don't want to be judgmental. Because if you normalize it and you watch it on TV, if I could put it that way, on TV, everybody in EastEnders has an affair. So that's just the way it goes, you know. So now actually having an affair has become more trivial. It's less of a struggle for somebody. So unless you're someone who's actually internalized some behavior and it's not going to just affect you and it's never going to be a question, more people are going to fail. You see the process. So there is something of this in the preserving, the flavouring, purifying, preserving, fertilising, which comes across when Jesus uses this reference to salt. Then he says, you're the light of the world. The city set on the hill can't be hidden. And that really is Jesus' growing up context. This is the town of Sepphoris, which is 3.5 miles to the north of Nazareth. And you can see, if you're down on the lake shore, it's about 3 miles away. You can see it on top of the hill because of the lights at night. You can visually look up the hill, and there it is. You're a city set on a hill. You can't be hidden. So people don't light a lamp, put it under a basket. Rather, they set it on a lampstand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. So let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and give glory to your Father in heaven. You get a little tie in there, which is something I touched on already, this idea that the rabbis had of the way your righteousness works, which Jesus is picking up, which helps us understand how he's presenting it. So he says, so Psalm 112 here, I put Yahweh, it says rejoice, but I just thought we'd put something in there to make you think. Blessed is the man. Well, that's a bit like he's just said. Yeah, blessed are those, blessed is he, blessed is those, blessed are you now because you're being persecuted. So blessed is the man. So what's this blessed man like? Well, he fears Yahweh and he delights greatly in his instruction. In other words, and his instruction here is the law, the 10 Commandments, because it's Old Testament context, the things that have been taught. For us, it's the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount. This is his instruction. He delights in this. He makes it real. He spends time thinking about it. He takes the idea of the truth that will set you free and it becomes character. So his seed will be mighty in the land and the generation of the upright will be blessed. So blessed ideas. Wealth and riches are in his house. His righteousness endures forever. So he has become righteous because he's engaged enthusiastically with instruction. And he shines in the darkness, a light for the upright, gracious, merciful and righteous. There is something about, if I've done this, if I've gone to my source of salt, if we put it that way, which for the rabbis was the Old Testament, which is what that rabbi was talking about in the Talmuds, salt won't lose its saltiness, because that's the thing. But actually, it's worked into me. I'm like stuff you've drawn out of the Dead Sea. I've got a bit of salt in me, but I've got other rubbish as well. I'm a bit of a work in progress. But just as pure salt, the instruction of God has made me salty, I become then salt to the earth, you see. So actually I'm supposed to be a light. I'm supposed to be salty. I'm supposed to be righteous. And those who may not be engaging directly with instruction are at least consuming us. And we're having an impact and the culture is rising. So don't think I've come to abolish the law of the prophets. I haven't. I've not come to abolish them, but to complete them. So Jesus is very conscious that what he is giving in one sense is an additional layer, but actually it's an additional layer that really makes us engage with the 10 Commandments differently. He's helping us to see how they need to become internalized much more seriously. The rabbis have already got those ideas. They've already talked about those things. But he's really drawing it home. For sure, I tell you. In fact, have I missed the verse about if salt's lost its saltiness? Let me run back. I think I missed. Oh dear, I think I obviously missed out that verse when I put my slides together.
In the beginning, Christian.
Oh, did I? Okay, yeah, the salt losing its saltiness. When he says it's only good for trampling underfoot, actually the trampling underfoot is still a function. It's just the worst. And so if salt loses its saltiness totally, it's thought that it became you wouldn't even use it as fertilizer now. You just put it on the path. At least it can become part of the ballast that holds the path together. Those minerals that are left whenever all of the sodium chloride has been washed out of them. So there's a real, just trying to give real context. So it's less symbolic. There is symbolism, but the symbolism is based on very real concrete bits of engineering, if I can put it that way. So I didn't come to abolish the law and the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to complete them. For sure I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not a single jot nor a pen stroke shall pass away from the law until all things are accomplished. You see, and this is one of those verses that a lot of people struggle with, because Jesus seems to, Paul seems to say we don't need the law. It's not by law, it's by faith. But actually, we still use the law for what it's supposed to give us. It's not about salvation, it's about transformation. If I meditate on and I take seriously, I'm going to honour my parents, I'm going to honour the Lord my God, I'm not going to murder, and that's quite good. I'm not going to commit adultery, but I'm not going to bear false witness. If I'm meditating on those things and I'm internalizing, they're still having their impact on me even today, even though I'm not saved by keeping them. Does that make sense? They're never going to disappear, and in fact I'm completing them, and so now we need to add my understanding, Jesus' understanding of these things, which actually part of the difference is that he does make the laws less external and more internal. So whoever breaks one of the commandments, and even the least of them, and teaches others to do the same, will be called least in the kingdom. You see, it's not that they're no longer in the kingdom. So if you break the commandments and you teach others to do the same, you don't get kicked out of the kingdom, but you're least. You're not going to be effective. You're not fruitful as part of the kingdom. Whereas whoever keeps and teaches them will be called great. Why? Because it does produce the transformation. As we saw right at the beginning, that transformation leads to a place of favour with God and with people. So you're going to be much more fruitful, productive if you're doing these things. You're working through that process. It's nothing to do with salvation here. It's to do with this transformation, the internalization of that righteous morality. It's not just that you're doing the right thing, you're doing it the right way. See, the old way was just do the right thing for the wrong motives, and that's actually why the rabbi's teaching was so messed up, as we'll see as we go through the sermon. Because I'm going to tell you, unless your righteousness significantly exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now here we've got the idea of righteousness trying to get you into the kingdom. But I think if you put it into its context, we have to understand it. I say we have to because of the way it flows with other ideas, is that it's not your right. It's possible to enter God's kingdom by righteousness, but our understanding theologically is Jesus is the only one who did it for us. So we now come in via a different route, which is faith. Actually, if you're going to try and do it by righteousness, you're going to have to do a lot better than the scribes and the Pharisees do. So kind of drawing it all together, what we're going to see as we kind of unpack the rest of the verses is we're going to revisit the concept of righteousness in terms of our hunger and thirsting for it. But we're going to see actually how Jesus regularly takes ideas. You've heard it said, the ancients said, it was said to those before, this, and this, but now I say to you this. and actually that the bit that Jesus added, he turns it into something that needs to be internalized. So it's not that we no longer need to worry about don't murder. It's just that don't murder is just the external. It's doing the right thing, but for the wrong reasons. We need to have internalized it. So there's not the desire in us to punch somebody's lights up when they cut us up at or like happened to me, where I'd gone to 3 petrol stations. I had to get to London and back because I'm helping look after my parents at the moment. And I didn't have enough petrol, so before I got on the motorway, I wanted to find a petrol station that was open on Thursday. And I'd gone to 2, and I'd queued up, and then they'd run out of petrol. I was driving up the road. I could see one on the other side, so I indicated, and there was an entrance that was only available for cars coming from my side of the road. And I drove around it, and it took me straight to a petrol station, to a petrol pump. And the other side of the road, there was a queue going about 2 miles up the road. And somebody got very angry with me, but I was only doing what the law told me to do. So anyway, I'm just saying, if you're internally angry with people, you'll struggle with these things. But if you only don't murder because you're told you're not to, you can still struggle with anger and blow up at people. Actually, how do you take that idea that was there in the Ten Commandments and internalize it in a way that produces peace in you? That's the drive and the thrust that Jesus does so uniquely in the way he interprets several of the commandments. Multiples of the commandments get referenced in the sermon as we go through it. So we're going to get on to that good news. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness; they'll be satisfied. When we get to verse 5, chapter 5, verse 6. Sorry, that is the beatitude in 5:6. We're going to unpack that in a couple of weeks' time, in a few weeks' time. So we will be revisiting it. But I think at this stage, really, I knew I'd come to the end. I've brain dumped again huge amounts of information and putting it together from different angles. Most of you will be aware I kind of coach both into the Christian context and then also into a secular context. And of course, I've been a church pastor for quite a few years, so I think about both of these areas, both of these aspects, the psychological and the theological. You'll kind of pick it up week by week. I'm strongly convinced that there's a huge thread of developmental theology in the New Testament, starting from the Sermon on the Mount, that somehow we've missed because we've turned it into sort of spiritual platitudes, which I don't want to sound rude on Scripture, because I'm not. I'm saying that 2,000 years in the church, we've kind of got a bit dull with it. It's actually very dynamic, and I really do pray that comes through. So I'll finish with this slide up. As I said, I do these as free to attend, but I live by ministry and so on. It's really helpful if you find this is useful. You can do it week by week, or you can do it at the end or something. You can take a photo of that. It will take you to a PayPal link if you want to just put something in as an offering. So do it in those ways. But is there anyone would like to ask anything or state anything or suggest anything or just draw out comments?